The Man with No Camp. War, Exile, and the Lonely Country Between Iran and Empire. By Elias Winter. March 1st, 2026. Read by an automated voice.
Chapter 1. The Man Between Three Flags. He is watching the war from a rented room in North America. Outside, the parking lot is a geometry of minivans and pickup trucks, the sky the color of dishwater. Inside, three objects share the same narrow desk, a green card in a plastic sleeve, a worn French passport with its soft tricolor, and a small blue booklet from the Islamic Republic of Iran, whose emblem still smells, in his imagination, of dust and loudspeakers. On the screen, a panel of American faces explains to him what is happening to his country. He mutes them. The room is quiet, except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the distant, unreal siren of an ambulance somewhere off the highway. On his phone, a telegram thread scrolls by in Farsi. Shaky videos of explosions, rumors of bases hit, maps with red arrows, a woman's voice crying, Ya Hossein, into a pixelated night. In another window, French radio commentators say, La République Islamique, with that particular Parisian mix of boredom and slight disgust. Somewhere between those vowels, his parents are sitting in their small apartment near Paris, watching the same news on TF1, making tea they cannot taste. He was born in Iran, then smuggled by fortune into France at 2, a small body carrying an entire nation in his blood and none of its paperwork in his hand. From 2 to 10, his world was French playground asphalt, République classrooms, the thin paper of Carnets de Correspondance. He learned to write Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité before he learned the Farsi alphabet properly. When he recited Liberté in class, he could hear his parents on the metro at dawn, going to jobs their diplomas never promised them. At 10, he went back to Tehran. It was like waking up inside someone else's memory. Satellite dishes like grey flowers on every rooftop, the smell of gasoline and bread, posters of martyrs with their too bright eyes. Ashura processions in the street, men beating their chests, drums, chains hitting skin, the air thick with grief and exhaust. At 14, he stood in a school courtyard while a Basiji teacher lectured them about America, the great Satan, the decadence of the West. That same year, he discovered a contraband CD of American music and the first volume of Hafez his grandfather left behind. In one ear, Hotel California. In the other, from the Church of the Lovers, I bring good news. You were born for more than the cage. He has lived ever since between those two sentences. Now, in this neutral American room, American anchors talk about decisive strikes and degrading Iran's capacity. The graphics behind them are smooth, bloodless, blue. He knows better. He knows what capacity is made of. Cousins sleeping in apartment blocks near military sites, anesthesiologists whose night shifts are about to turn into triage marathons, families who have already spent 40 years grinding their teeth on sanctions. He knows the particular way a mother in Karaj will say, Koda nakone, when the sirens start, how she will call her son's name twice before he answers, how she will secretly, silently inventory the family's medicine supply while everyone else shouts about America. The sentence that he cannot say aloud is simple and monstrous. I don't want America to win. He does not want the Islamic Republic to win either. The regime has already stolen enough, from the women whose hair became a battlefield, from the men whose faith was turned into a surveillance system, from the children whose playgrounds were painted with slogans instead of colors. He remembers the guidance patrols, the sudden slap of authority in a woman's face for a strand of hair, the sermons that tasted like rust. He has no love for the men who rule Tehran. But when American jets streak toward Isfahan, when Israeli intelligence officials brief the New York Times with anonymous satisfaction about degrading capabilities, something in him hardens like scar tissue. The country that gave him shelter is now flying toward the country that gave him his mother tongue, and neither of them is speaking honestly. He thinks of a line of Foro Farrokhzad. I come from the land of dolls, from under the shadow of death. He thinks of a line of Camus. I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice. He thinks of the hollow reassurance of the French president when he says, in exquisite conditional tense, that la communauté internationale ne peut rester silencieuse, while doing almost nothing that would actually risk anything. He is an Iranian whose mother tongue sings of gardens and ruins, a French citizen who learned that the state is secular and the church is private, and a North American resident in a country where the church is invisible, but the empire is everywhere. He is watching a war in which each of these entities is implicated, and there is no camp he can honestly join. Persian poetry taught him that homeland is not just soil, it is language, it is the taste of pomegranates, it is the way an old man in a park recites Hafez from memory and then feeds pigeons. France taught him that the state can be both hypocritical and serious in its promises, that citoyen is a word with weight and also a costume. America taught him that you can build an empire of screens so total that truth becomes a rumor. Now those three lessons collide over Iran. He feels rage at the United States and Israel for using his homeland as a theater where they can prove to themselves and each other that they are still in charge. He feels rage at the Islamic Republic for having turned that homeland into a cockpit of permanent crisis, an endless reservoir of martyrdom and slogans. He feels rage at himself for being safe while others are not, and at the same time terrified of losing that safety if immigration law decides that his birthplace makes him suspect. He is lonely, not just because he has no camp, but because everyone around him seems so eager to have one. In Los Angeles, some of the exiled chant for harsher bombing of Tehran's rulers, as if bombs had the courtesy to discriminate. In Paris, some mutter, c'est compliqué, and change the subject. On American television, the war appears as a segment between ads for cars and medications, narrated in the same calm tone as the weather. He opens his own archive on Substack. There, under the name Elias Winter, he has already written the anatomy of this war long before the first bomb fell. About rooms where the public is not invited. About ministries that ask the people to shut up. About the pornography of lies. About solidarity that refuses to own the people it claims to defend. He scrolls through his sentences and thinks, I have built a country here. A small republic of language where he can say what cannot be said in any camp. Tonight, he walks along its border, and there is no one else on the road.
Chapter 2. Reading My Own Country. I did not realize until this war that I'd been quietly building an entire worldview in public, a kind of republic of one, complete with constitution, jurisprudence, and ghosts. This is a literature review of myself. If I am going to say anything honest about why I cannot join the American camp or the Iranian regime or the cheering diaspora or the French balanced spectators, I have to show my work. Not because anyone is demanding citations, but because I do not trust my own feelings unless I can trace their genealogy. Section 1. The Room, the Ministry, and the Cathedral of Lies. In The People Are Not in the Room, I argued that modern democracy is theater built over oligarchic plumbing. Decisions of real consequence are made by organized minorities, donors, corporate boards, permanent bureaucracies, while the majority is invited to shout from the seats and believe they are participating. Elections become rituals that legitimize decisions already framed elsewhere. That essay was my first clear statement that when the United States goes to war, it is not the American people who have decided. It is a room, a small, insulated architecture of intelligence briefings, donor anxieties, geopolitical fantasies, and professional risk calculations. The public is informed, not consulted. In the ministry of asking the public to shut up, I went further. I described a media political complex whose job is not to listen to outrage, but to measure and manage it. Anger becomes a KPI. When people flood the streets or social media against a war, the system does not hear no. It hears, we must adjust the script, not the policy. Outrage is translated into messaging tweaks, not course correction. In the pornography of lies, I tried to map the larger cathedral in which this ministry lives. A civilization where the respectable press and the vulgar channels play complementary roles in preserving power. One whispers obedience to educated liberals. The other screams resentment to the humiliated. Their apparent opposition is a duet. Online platforms then reduce all of this to pornographic consumption. Massacre videos, outrage thumbnails, synthetic AI prophets delivering infinite counterfeit indignation. By the time the first missiles were launched at Iran, I had already concluded that any story told by this cathedral about war would be contaminated. It would be designed to seduce, anesthetize, or arouse, not to tell the truth. So when I watch American and European coverage of strikes on Iran, I am not a citizen receiving information. I am a reader of my own earlier indictment, recognizing the patterns I already drew. Section 2. Iran, Exile, and Refusing Ownership. My relationship to Iran is not a geopolitical position. It is blood, language, humiliation, and love stapled together. In solidarity without ownership, I tried to write an ethic for loving a country you cannot safely live in and cannot honestly defend. I wrote about the way the 1979 revolution began as a revolt of dignity, against torture, against foreign manipulation, against royal arrogance, and was then captured by a disciplined clerical minority who turned faith into a technology of control. I argued that the Iranian people are hostages 3 times over, to their own regime, to foreign powers who use their suffering as leverage, and to diasporas who try to claim their bravery as content. Solidarity, I said, means walking with them without turning them into a brand or a justification. In The Man Who Called His People Neanderthals, I dissected my own contempt. I told the story of Kian, the exile who calls his compatriots Neanderthals when he sees them cheering for demagogues and strongmen abroad. Underneath his insult, I revealed, is grief. Grief that his people have been humiliated long enough to crave any boot that promises to step on their enemies. Grief that he might have become one of them had his childhood gone only slightly differently. That essay was my confession that I have no right to feel superior to Iranians who cling to bad saviors. I am only an accident or 2 away from them. In the long war for the temple, I took a longer view. I wrote about Rome and Persia, Jerusalem as wound, Islam's lightning rise into a world of exhausted empires. I traced how Persia lost the sword but won the pen, how it bent under Arab conquest but eventually poured its soul into Islam itself. I described America as an heir of Rome, a maritime power playing the old imperial game in the Holy Land and beyond. That piece anchored my intuition that the U.S.-Iran conflict is not just about centrifuges or missiles. It is an episode in a millennia-long struggle between different ways of organizing memory, law, and sacred space. When American commentators speak of pressuring Iran, I hear the latest dialect of Rome addressing Persia. Finally, in The Empire That Needs Our Silence, I tried to expose how Western talk about Iran demands that Iranians either shut up or agree. Any nuanced position that refuses both the regime and imperial paternalism is treated as suspect. The empire does not merely want obedience, it wants grateful clients. When I put these essays together, my feelings in this war stop looking like mood and start looking like a coherent refusal. I will not cheer for the regime that cages my people, and I will not bless the empires that bomb them in the name of saving them. Section 3. Resentment, Hatred, and the Trap. If I stopped there, my stance would still be incomplete. It would contain a hidden toxin: revenge. In the Pact of Hatred, I wrote that alliances formed on shared hatred are loans taken out against the future of the soul. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sounds clever, but it means I will stand beside a monster if he wounds the devil I fear more. From European diplomacy to Cold War proxies, I traced how coalitions built on resentment eventually turn into betrayals and monsters. That essay was not tilted at some remote history. It was aimed at my own chest. There is a part of me that wants the American and Israeli war machines to fail, not just for the sake of Iranian lives, but because I want their omnipotence punctured. I want proof that empire's reach has limits. I want the cathedral of lies to crack. That desire is not clean. It contains hatred. In the Pact of Hatred, I warned that hatred is never stable. It mutates and returns. To form a political or spiritual identity primarily around what you despise is to slowly become shaped by it. Nietzsche said, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become one." I added, the meme, the retweet, the gleeful amplification of anything that wounds your enemies. These are the sacraments of that becoming. So when I hear the sentence in the back of my mind, I want Iran to win, I have to interrogate it. Do I want the hostage to escape? Or do I want the jailer humiliated? Do I want dignity? Or do I want revenge? The answer, if I'm honest, is both impulses are there. My own writing commands me to choose. Section 4. The Self as a Small Republic. These essays about empire, attention, Iran, resentment are not isolated rants. Alongside them stand other pillars. The Night the Animals Stayed Sober, where I described addiction as a refusal to abandon oneself. The Price of Bread and the Price of Mercy, where I tried to measure fiscal language against the reality of hunger. The Sovereign of Attention, where I traced worship from temples to algorithms. Taken together, they describe a worldview with a few non-negotiable principles. Humiliation is a spiritual crime. Power lies systematically. The poor and the afflicted are the real test of any system. Hatred cannot be the foundation of liberation. Attention is sacred and easily stolen. No empire, religious or secular, is trustworthy when it claims to act on behalf of the very people it silences. Given that architecture, it would be strange if I felt anything other than isolation in this war. My own work has made me structurally homeless. But there is another consequence. I am not entirely alone. When I look back over these essays, I can see shadows moving between the lines. Other people, long dead, who walked similar roads of refusal. Thinkers, prophets, and writers who stood between camps and were punished for it. If I am going to survive this epic without becoming a caricature of my own anger, I need their company, not as badges, but as case studies. What follows is not hagiography. It is an inquiry into the lonely dead.
Chapter 3. The Lineage of Lonely Minds. Spinoza, the excommunicated lens grinder. In a narrow Dutch street in the 17th century, a young man of Portuguese Jewish descent is handed a document that severs him from his community. The cherem against Baruch Spinoza is unusually harsh. It does not only ban him from the synagogue, it curses him. The elders declare that he is cut off from the people of Israel, that no one may speak to him or read his writings. The exact reasons are not recorded, but we know the themes. He questioned traditional notions of God, denied the immortality of the soul, refused to accept the Bible as literal dictation. Spinoza could have recanted, He did not. Instead, he walked out into a Europe where Christians also eyed him with suspicion. He rented modest rooms and made his living grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes, handling glass that allowed others to see what the naked eye could not. In his spare hours, he wrote a philosophy in which God is not a bearded monarch in the sky, but the infinite substance of which everything is a mode. He tried to think a world where law and freedom, necessity and joy could coexist without miracles. He belonged nowhere. To Jews, he was a traitor. To Christians, a heretic. To political authorities, a potential threat. He died at 44, likely from lung damage caused by inhaling glass dust, with only a small circle of friends who understood even part of what he had attempted. What does a man like that offer me? First, the reminder that being exiled from one's tribe can be the price of intellectual honesty. Spinoza did not seek exile for its own sake. He simply refused to lie about what he saw. When I refuse to flatter Iranian nationalism or American myth, when I decline to participate in French performance of balanced concern, I am in a very minor key repeating his act, choosing exile over obedience. Second, the image of a life that is quiet, modest, and still world-altering. Spinoza did not have a platform. He had lenses and manuscripts that circulated in handwritten copies. His isolation did not stop him from doing serious metaphysical work. In an age of clicks, his example is insulting and liberating. It tells me that recognition is not a prerequisite for depth. The danger in Spinoza's solitude is another kind of temptation. To decide that obscurity itself is a badge of purity. To cultivate neglect as proof that one is right. He did not do that. He simply accepted his marginality. I am not sure I am as clean. From him, I learned that a man can be cut off from his people and still remain in conversation with reality itself. That is a standard far higher than gathering followers. It is a way of salvaging honor from loneliness. Kierkegaard, the single individual. Copenhagen is a small city for a man with too many thoughts. Søren Kierkegaard walks its streets like a ghost, who keeps bumping into people who only know him as the son of a wealthy merchant, or the odd figure who broke off his engagement to a beloved young woman and then wrote books about anxiety, faith, and despair under a dozen pseudonyms. He is a Christian who despises Christendom, the cozy alliance between church and state that makes faith into a cultural habit. He attacks pastors in the press, mocks the Danish bourgeoisie, spends his inheritance on publishing strange little books that almost nobody buys. He insists on the single individual standing alone before God. Crowds, he says, are untruth. Truth is a relation, an inward posture, not a doctrine you can hold like a library card. He dies at 42, after collapsing in the street, having refused communion from the state church he denounced. His loneliness is not only social, it is metaphysical. He believes that to be serious about faith in a complacent age is to accept being misunderstood, perhaps even by those closest to you. My situation is more secular, but structurally similar. When I refuse to join the loud crowds, pro-regime, pro-war, pro-empire, pro-revenge, I am staking my position as a single individual before something like conscience. The crowd's outrage, even when justified, is often mixed with vanity and hatred. To stand apart is not to deny its grievances, but to refuse its shortcuts. Kierkegaard warns me, though, that there is a thin line between honest separation and performative contrarianism. You can begin by criticizing the crowd out of love for truth, and end by needing the crowd to be wrong so that you can feel right. His broken engagement also whispers another warning. Solitude does not only protect integrity, it can also be an evasion of intimacy, a way of avoiding the compromises and patience that relationships demand. If I sanctify my isolation too much, I may be baptizing my own fear. Still, the Dane gives me language for something I have felt wordlessly: the obligation to be faithful to what I see, even if it leaves me standing alone in a room where everyone else is chanting one of two slogans. Simone Weil, Refusal at the Edge. Simone Weil might be the purest and most frightening companion on this road. French, Jewish by birth, fiercely drawn to Christ, yet never quite entering the church, she worked in factories to experience the humiliation of the worker's life, attempted to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and spent the final stretch of her brief life in exile in England during World War II, writing notebooks that feel like telegrams from another moral planet. She refused fascism, but she also refused the easy rhetoric of anti-fascist triumph. She refused capitalism, but she did not sanctify the Soviet Union. She refused nationalism, but she understood the ache for rootedness. Her solidarity with the oppressed was so intense that, when she learned of rationing in occupied France, she restricted her own food intake in England to what she imagined her compatriots received, contributing to the physical collapse that killed her at 34. With Weil, you cannot easily separate sanctity from pathology. Her refusal to accept comfort while others starved is at once Christ-like and self-destructive. Her insistence on attention as the purest form of love is luminous. Her suspicion of all earthly belonging can feel like a rejection of the human condition itself. She shows me what happens when you push refusal to its limit. There is a part of me that recognizes her impulse. If Iranian civilians are under bombs, if Gaza is under rubble, if American wars are waged in my name, what right do I have to go to the gym, to order coffee, to write in peace? The logic of identification is endless, and Weil pursued it almost to death. From her, I learned the danger of trying to prove sincerity with suffering. My task is not to make my body as endangered as those in Isfahan or Rafah. It is to refuse to let comfort anesthetize me into complicity, without turning guilt into a new idol. Simone Weil's loneliness was of a specific kind. She was too severe for almost everyone. Not because she was cruel, but because she took the Sermon on the Mount literally. The world does not know what to do with that. Looking at her, I understand that if I am going to inhabit this war as an exile with a conscience, I must accept that I will never be pure. My hands are not clean, but I cannot make them clean by breaking them. I have to keep them steady enough to write, to help, to witness. Dostoevsky, The Underground and the Stage. Fyodor Dostoevsky was arrested in 1849 for involvement in a discussion circle that read forbidden texts. He stood in front of a firing squad, heard the rifles loaded, and then received, at the last moment, a commuted sentence to Siberian exile. That staging of his own execution entered his nerves forever. He returned with a faith more complex than the state's orthodoxy, and a vision more unsettling than the radicals' manifestos. He saw through the hypocrisies of Russian aristocracy, the shallowness of imported European liberalism, and the suicidal glamour of nihilism. He wrote novels in which every ideology gets a voice, and every voice is compromised. He was not fully at home in any camp. Conservatives found his psychological chaos unnerving. Radicals found his religious motifs reactionary. Westernizers thought him barbaric. Later, Western liberals would cherry-pick his humanism and forget his more disturbing prophecies. His later life was shaped by poverty, illness, gambling debts, and frantic deadlines. He did not die alone, but he died misunderstood, his true weight only recognized much later. What connects us is not narrative scale, but structural distrust of single stories. In a war like this, every camp wants a simple Dostoevskian character: the noble freedom fighter, the demonic mullah, the heroic pilot, the innocent American soldier. Dostoevsky refuses that. His murderers are sentimental. His saints are neurotic. His revolutionaries are wounded. His policemen are sometimes decent. From him I take a method: to see the war as a tangle of wounded motives, seductions, resentments, and genuine loves, not as a cartoon. To remember that inside every Iranian general there is a frightened boy, and inside every American strategist there is a story about duty and fear, and that none of this cancels the moral weight of their decisions. The risk in Dostoevsky's vision is paralysis. If everyone is tragic, no one is responsible. I do not want that. I want his polyphony, not his tendency to drown in it. Nietzsche, When the Bridge Gives Way. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in small Swiss and Italian rooms, often alone, often in pain. He broke with his mentor Wagner over anti-Semitism and nationalism, rejected Christianity, distrusted socialism, despised the complacent bourgeois culture of his day. He declared that God is dead not as a boast, but as a diagnosis of cultural exhaustion. He spoke of the need to create new values, to become who one is. He also slid, in his last decade, into psychological collapse, leaving behind a body of work that would be mutilated by his sister and appropriated by monsters he would have despised. Nietzsche's loneliness has an almost volcanic intensity. He is the man who sees the foundations cracking and cannot convince anyone to step back from the fault line. His contempt for the herd is sometimes clear-eyed, sometimes cruel. His ideal of the solitary creator is both inspiring and impossible. I see in him a warning about the endgame of radical isolation. Living in boarding houses, cut off from former friends, writing for a future that does not exist yet, he pushed his nervous system beyond what it could bear. Part of that was illness. Part of it was the strain of being permanently at war with all camps. In my weaker moments, when I feel the intoxication of being right against everyone, I hear Nietzsche's laughter and his scream. He reminds me that intellect without community, critique without tenderness, can eat itself. From him, I take a small, sharp lesson. Do not confuse being outnumbered with being profound, and do not imagine that the human mind can live forever at the pitch of denunciation without cracking. Hannah Arendt, Thinking Without a Home. Hannah Arendt fled Nazi Germany as a Jewish intellectual, found herself stateless for years, and eventually became an American citizen. She wrote about totalitarianism, the nature of evil, and the fragility of political life. When she covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann and coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," arguing that great crimes can be committed by ordinary, bureaucratic people, she enraged many in the Jewish community, especially with her criticism of Jewish counsel's role in Nazi administrative machinery. She experienced a kind of double exile, from her homeland and from parts of her own people. Arendt insisted on the right to judge, to think without banishing complexity. She refused both apologetics and demonization. She believed that love of a people does not require blindness to its failures. For that, she was called arrogant, cold, traitorous. Her situation maps closely onto mine. I am critical of the country that sheltered me, America, and of the country that birthed me, Iran. I love the people in both, and mistrust the states that speak in their names. I watch diaspora debates in which any critique of our side is labeled betrayal, and hear Arendt's voice saying, "Only in totalitarian systems is loyalty defined as unconditional support." From her, I learned to endure being misunderstood by the very communities I refuse to abandon. She maintained friendships, corresponded, taught students, loved people, even as she held positions that cost her invitations. That balance matters. She was lonely in some public ways, but not theatrically alone. She did not romanticize isolation. She built a life around thinking in company, even when that company disagreed. Camus, Justice and My Mother. Albert Camus grew up poor in colonial Algeria, the son of a cleaning woman, with a father killed in World War I. He became a writer and intellectual in France, a member of the resistance during Nazi occupation, then a celebrated novelist and essayist. When the Algerian War broke out, he occupied an impossible position. He understood the brutality and injustice of French colonial rule. He also feared the terrorism of the FLN, which targeted civilians, including those like his own family. When asked to take a side unequivocally, he famously said, "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." For this, he was denounced by parts of the French left as cowardly or compromised, and by French colonialists as disloyal. He ended up politically homeless, accused by nearly everyone of insufficient radicalism. Camus is the closest mirror I have. Like him, I am from a place that has been on the receiving end of imperial power and also deeply shaped by the culture of that empire. Like him, I refuse both the violence of the occupier and the indiscriminate violence of some who resist. Like him, I do not believe that the life of my own mother, sitting in a modest apartment in France, watching bombs fall on Tehran, is an acceptable price for anyone's ideological purity. His phrase about his mother is often read as a retreat from justice. I read it as an insistence that justice which ignores concrete human ties is already on the road to becoming another abstraction that feeds on bodies. From Camus, I take permission to say, I will not bless a war that claims to defend freedom while terrifying my parents. I will not bless a regime that claims to defend dignity while caging my cousins. And I will not sanctify terrorism as resistance when it targets the same ordinary people I claim to care about. His loneliness was the loneliness of a man who refused the consolations of clean sides. He died in a car crash at 46, leaving that refusal unfinished. It is now my job, in my own smaller context, to continue it. Jeremiah, the prophet who stayed. Jeremiah is a figure of legend, not of modern archive, but his story recurs in human history. A man tells his own people that disaster is coming if they do not change. They mock him, imprison him, call him a traitor. He weeps for them even as he denounces their corruption. When the disaster arrives, the siege, the famine, the burning of the city, he is there to see it. Jeremiah's loneliness is not that of exile from his people, but of radical solidarity with them, even as he contradicts them. He does not go to Babylon. He stays in the smoking ruin. There is a part of me that wants to flee all camps entirely, to live in a pure elsewhere, an abstract republic of sentences where no one can stain me. Jeremiah rebukes that impulse. He reminds me that critique without presence is cheap. To love a people is to remain in some relation to their fate, not only to sit at a distance diagnosing their sickness. For me, that does not mean physically moving back to Iran or renouncing my other citizenships. It means refusing to speak of Iranians, Americans, or French as objects on a chessboard. It means letting their suffering stain me and not only as material for essays. Jeremiah teaches that you can be denounced by your own and still be faithful to them, that the measure of a prophet is not how right he was, but how much he loved those who ignored him.
Chapter 4. A Small Republic of One. War has a way of forcing choices. It demands flags, passwords, slogans. It tells you that nuance is evasive, that complexity is betrayal, that anything short of enthusiasm is treason. I live in a triangular field: Iran, France, America. Over it, planes are flying and words are falling. From Spinoza, I have learned that exile can be the honest consequence of refusing to lie. From Kierkegaard, that the single individual must sometimes stand against the crowd to remain sane. From Simone Weil, that refusal must not turn into self-destruction. From Dostoevsky, that every war contains a chorus of damaged souls, not just heroes and villains. From Nietzsche, that isolation should not be mistaken for virtue, and that minds can break. From Hannah Arendt, that thinking without a homeland is possible, but it requires courage to disappoint one's own. From Camus, that justice without concrete love is another name for abstraction, and that one may legitimately say, "my mother," in the face of grand causes. From Jeremiah, that to rebuke a people is not to cease belonging to them. So where does that leave me in this war? It leaves me here. I refuse the Islamic Republic's claim to speak for Iran. I have seen what its theology does to women's hair, to men's consciences, to children's games. I do not celebrate its missiles, its militias, or its slogans. I do not confuse its defiance of America with dignity. A prison that resists a foreign warden is still a prison. I refuse the American and Israeli claim to wage war for freedom, for stability, for the good of the Iranian people. I know too much of their history, their coups, their sanctions, their selective empathy, their media choreography. I do not trust their intelligence assessments, their surgical strikes, their talk of regrettable but necessary civilian casualties. A missile wrapped in human rights language kills just as surely. I refuse diaspora fantasies that cheer for bombing Tehran in the hope of liberation, as if B-52s could deliver democracy, as if the bodies buried under rubble would be acceptable collateral for the birth of a new flag. I refuse coalitions built on hatred of one side more than love of any people. I refuse memes that reduce complicated histories to team colors. I refuse to amplify lies that conveniently support my disgust. I also refuse to sit in pure judgment. I cannot pretend to watch this like a neutral philosopher. So I will do something smaller and, for me, harder. I will stay evidence-bound. I will not share rumors because they flatter my hope that empire is failing or that the regime is weakening. I will read what I can from multiple sources, and when I do not know, I will say, "I do not know." I will keep my attention sacred. I will not consume massacre videos as a daily snack. I will not jerk my conscience around for the thrill of outrage. When I watch images of Iranian or Palestinian or Israeli dead, I will remember that they are people, not proof. I will keep mercy as a non-negotiable. If a position requires cheering for the suffering of civilians, I will reject it, no matter how righteous its cause claims to be. If my anger starts to savor the idea of American humiliation more than Iranian survival, I will name that as corruption. I will accept loneliness as the price of this position, but I will not romanticize it. I will look for a small, serious handful of companions who can tolerate tension without rushing to the nearest flag. If I find 2 or 3 such people, that will be enough for a kind of tiny polis, a city of conversation in the middle of noise. And I will keep writing, not because writing changes bombs, but because writing can keep a human being from dissolving into propaganda, including his own. I am a man with no camp. That is not a heroism. It is a description. But between the camps there is still ground, narrow, windswept, often empty, but real. It is the ground where exiles pace, where prophets mutter, where a few philosophers grind their lenses and look up at a sky that belongs to no flag. That is my country. If it has a flag at all, it is invisible. A piece of cloth woven from the refusal to lie, the refusal to hate as a way of joining, the refusal to forget that every target on a map is a place where someone like my parents or my cousins or your neighbors are trying to live a normal life. The war will go on, for months perhaps, maybe longer. Empires will perform themselves. Regimes will frame their defiance as holiness. Commentators will speak. Markets will adjust. Algorithms will chew through our nerves. In that noise, I choose this small republic of one. Its constitution is simple. Tell the truth as far as you can see it. Do not worship power, even when it is yours. Do not abandon the afflicted, even when they are theirs. Do not let hatred write your prayers. Remember your parents' faces when you hear the word strike. I may die still lonely in this position. Many before me did. But if I can keep this ground intact inside myself while the flags burn and flutter above, I will not have lived entirely in vain. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.